Mohenjo-Daro. In 1922, on the banks of the Indus River, in what is now Pakistan, archaeologists brushed away the dust from something extraordinary. An entire city emerged from the earth. Sophisticated, planned, breathtakingly modern in its design, grid-patterned streets. A centralized drainage system so advanced it wouldn't be matched in Europe for another 3,000 years. Multi-story buildings, public baths, a civilization of perhaps 40,000 people thriving at the exact moment the Egyptians were raising the pyramids. By every measure, a civilization at the absolute height of its power. And then, around 1900 BCE, it ended, overnight, suddenly, without the slow signatures of famine or invasion. When excavators reached the deepest layers, they found 44 human skeletons scattered in the streets, not buried, not arranged, simply fallen mid-stride, mid-motion, as if every living person in the city had been struck down simultaneously without a single moment of warning. But the skeletons were not the most disturbing thing they found. At the center of the city, excavators uncovered thousands of fused, crystallized, bubbled objects scattered across what had once been streets. British researcher David Davenport spent 12 years studying the site and identified what he called an epicenter, a 50-yard-wide zone where everything had been crystallized, fused, or melted. 60 yards from the center, bricks were melted on one side only, indicating a directional blast. The material had been vitrified, transformed by temperatures estimated at 1500 degrees Celsius, hotter than flowing lava, hotter than any known ancient fire source, hotter than any siege weapon, any volcanic event recorded in the geological history of the region. And Mohenjo-Daro is not alone. It is not an anomaly. It is not a mystery that belongs only to the Indus Valley or only to the Bronze Age. Across 10 ancient sites on 5 continents, across 8,000 years of human history, archaeologists have found the exact same signature: stone melted, cities obliterated, temperatures that ancient hands should never have been able to generate. A pattern so consistent, so geographically impossible to explain by any single cause, that researchers who have spent careers studying these sites keep arriving at the same uncomfortable place. Something happened, repeatedly, to civilizations that had no contact with each other. And the Earth itself, in ways the Earth does not lie, remembers exactly what it felt. These are 10 ancient ruins that were mysteriously melted by a forgotten catastrophe. Tall el-Hammam. On the northeastern shore of the Dead Sea, in the modern country of Jordan, there is a place that most people have never heard of, a mound of earth called Tall el-Hammam. In the Middle Bronze Age, around 1650 BCE, it was a thriving city. Large, prosperous, heavily populated, sitting on high ground in one of the most fertile corridors of the ancient world. A palace complex 4 to 5 stories tall, massive mud brick ramparts 4 meters thick. By the standards of its era, it was a major urban center. And then, in a single instant, it ceased to exist. The destruction layer at Tall el-Hammam tells a story that stops people cold. It is 1.5 meters thick across the entire city, a consistent band of carbon, ash, and obliterated material covering every excavated section of the site. Within that layer, researchers found something that defied every conventional explanation. Pottery sherds with outer surfaces melted into glass. Mud bricks that had been vaporized, not burned, not collapsed, vaporized, leaving only their foundations behind. Shocked quartz crystals that had been subjected to pressures between 5 and 10 gigapascals, pressures that, geologists will tell you, occur in nature in exactly 2 circumstances: a nuclear detonation or a cosmic impact event. Melted platinum, melted iridium, melted zircon, nickel, gold, chromite, a temperature signature confirmed by laboratory heating experiments to have exceeded 2,000 degrees Celsius. To put that in context, that is hotter than the surface of volcanic lava. It is hotter than any known natural ground-level fire. It is the kind of heat that does not come from below, it comes from above. In 2021, a team of 21 scientists from 19 different institutions published a landmark paper in the journal Scientific Reports. Their conclusion, carefully worded after 15 years of excavation, was that the evidence was consistent with a cosmic airburst, a meteor or comet fragment detonating in the atmosphere above the city, releasing energy the researchers estimated to be greater than the 1908 Tunguska explosion in Siberia. That explosion, which flattened 2,000 square kilometers of Siberian forest, was roughly 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. And the researchers said Tall El Hammam took an even larger hit. The shockwave evidence was in the walls themselves. They did not fall inward from fire. They were blown outward and down, compressed into the earth by a pressure front arriving from above. The palace complex was demolished to its foundations. The ramparts were pulverized. Human bones in the destruction layer showed what the paper described as extreme disarticulation and skeletal fragmentation, a phrase that is clinical and that nonetheless produces a very specific image in the mind of anyone who reads it. But there is something else at Tal el Hammam, something that connects this scientific evidence to one of the oldest stories ever written. The destruction layer contains anomalously high concentrations of salt, an average of 4% in the sediment, and as high as 25% in some samples. The researchers proposed that the airburst, detonating over the salt-rich environment of the Dead Sea Basin, aerosolized and distributed salt across the entire region in a single catastrophic moment. The surrounding valleys were rendered agriculturally sterile for centuries. All 16 major settled sites in the southern Jordan Valley appear to have been abandoned at precisely 1650 BCE. Jericho was not meaningfully resettled for 300 years. Tall El Hammam itself was not reoccupied for 600 years. You have almost certainly heard the story of this place under a different name. The Book of Genesis describes a city consumed in fire and brimstone, smoke rising like smoke from a furnace, a pillar of fire visible for miles. It describes Lot's wife looking back and turning into a pillar of salt. Whether Tall El Hammam was truly Sodom remains scientifically contested. But if the researchers who spent 15 years excavating that destruction layer are even partially correct, then the ancient writers were not composing mythology. They were attempting, with the vocabulary available to them, to describe the day the sky caught fire and a city full of people ceased to exist in a fraction of a second. The vitrified forts of Scotland. Imagine standing on a windswept hillside in the Scottish Highlands, cold Atlantic air, misty valleys stretching in every direction, the ruins of an ancient fortification rising before you. You reach out and touch the wall, and you stop, because the surface beneath your fingers is not rough stone. It is smooth, it is glassy, it is fused, not carved, not shaped fused, as if someone had applied the heat of a furnace directly to the rock and held it there until the stone itself became something else. There are more than 70 of these sites across Scotland, Iron Age hill forts, built roughly 2,500 to 3,000 years ago, whose walls have been subjected to temperatures so extreme that the stone itself melted. That is not a figure of speech. Granite, quartzite, feldspars, materials that require temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius to liquefy, had been transformed in place into a single glassy obsidian-like mass, as if the hillside itself had been inside a kiln. The temperatures researchers have measured in these walls range from 1,000 to 1,200 degrees Celsius. That is hotter than flowing lava. And to be completely precise about what that means, the melting was not superficial. The vitrification penetrated the full depth of the wall construction. It was not applied from the outside with a torch. It required sustained, controlled, impossibly intense heat directed into the stone from within. Modern researchers from the University of Stirling built a full-scale replica of a hill fort wall, 8 meters long, and burned it. Under anaerobic conditions, a fire deprived of oxygen, generating its own heat in a sealed timber and stone structure, they produced some vitrification. It was encouraging, and it was deeply incomplete. The quantity of timber required to replicate even partial vitrification at the scale found in sites like Tapo Noth in Aberdeenshire, one of the largest vitrified forts ever discovered at roughly 500 meters in diameter, would be staggering. Tens of thousands of logs, perfectly arranged, burned under precisely controlled conditions. But here is where this story turns strange. The vitrification, in many of these sites, did not weaken the walls. It strengthened them. Volcanologist Fabian Wadsworth at Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich confirmed through laboratory experiments that the intense heat transformed the mortar holding the stones together into a dense glass matrix that made the overall structure significantly more durable. Walls that should have crumbled under 2,500 years of Scottish weather are instead effectively indestructible, bonded together at the molecular level. Some researchers began asking a question that the destruction hypothesis cannot easily answer. Why would an attacking army burn your fort in a way that makes it stronger? The honest answer is that no one knows. Not archaeologists, not material scientists, not geologists. The deliberate burning theory exists. The enemy attack theory exists. The ritual closure theory exists. None of them are proven. The forts stand on their high Scottish hills, glassy and ancient and silent, guarding a secret that 8,000 years of rain has not yet washed away. Mohenjo-Daro. Let us return to the city we began with, because there is more the ground is trying to tell us. The conventional explanation for the vitrification at Mohenjo-Daro is cautious. The fused material, mainstream archaeology argues, was concentrated around pottery kilns. Kilns do produce vitrification. That is how pottery is made. And this is a reasonable explanation that addresses part of the evidence. But the part it does not address is the part that David Davenport, after 12 years at the site, kept returning to. The epicenter, the directional pattern. The bricks melted on one side. Materials engineer William Sturm, reviewing Davenport's documentation, concluded that the melting of the bricks at Mohenjo-Daro could not have been caused by a normal fire. Professor Antonio Castellani, a space engineer in Rome who examined the evidence, stated that what happened at Mohenjo-Daro was, in his assessment, not a natural phenomenon. Now consider the Hindu texts that existed long before any Western researcher ever set foot at the site. The Mahabharata, one of the longest epic poems in human history, describes a weapon called the Brahmastra, a weapon summoned through incantation, capable of destroying entire civilizations. It delivered, the text says, a flash brighter than 10,000 suns. The air shook, the water boiled. The dead were so thoroughly destroyed that survivors had to wait days before entering the blast zone. Those survivors found their hair falling out, their food contaminated, their skin marked by something invisible that moved through them relentlessly. Read those words stripped of their mythological framing. Read them as testimony: hair loss, contaminated food supplies, invisible sickness spreading through survivors, a defined blast zone requiring a waiting period. Those are not the symptoms of a sword. They are not the aftermath of a catapult. They are, with an uncomfortable precision that researchers keep noting and then carefully not naming, consistent with radiation exposure following a high-energy detonation event. When J. Robert Oppenheimer, the scientific director of the Manhattan Project, witnessed the first atomic detonation at Trinity, New Mexico in 1945, he quoted the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." He was not citing scripture because he was religious. He was citing scripture because the ancient Hindus appeared to have written about this specific experience. And when he was asked, years later, whether Trinity was truly the first nuclear detonation in history, Oppenheimer paused. His answer was, in modern times. Libyan desert glass. In the Egyptian Sahara, along the border with Libya, there is a place where the ground is covered in glass. Not manufactured glass, not volcanic glass. Glass formed when sand was heated to temperatures so extreme that it liquefied and then cooled in the open desert air. The glass covers roughly 2,500 square kilometers. It is pale yellow, sometimes clear, sometimes swirling with dark inclusions from whatever material was vaporized and caught up in the thermal event that created it. It is, by every measure of geological analysis, the most silica-pure natural glass ever found on Earth. It is also approximately 29 million years old, which means that whatever catastrophe created it had nothing to do with human civilization. But what created it reveals something important about what these temperatures actually look like when they arrive from the sky. In 2019, geoscientist Aaron Kavosi of Curtin University in Australia confirmed through transmission electron microscopy that the Libyan desert glass contains evidence of rhyodite, a mineral that forms when zircon is subjected to pressures of 130,000 atmospheres. Rhyolite has never been found anywhere on Earth except at confirmed meteorite impact sites. The temperatures required for its formation are between 2,250 and 2,700 degrees Celsius. And this glass covers an area the size of a small country. Here is the part that connects this ancient cosmic event to human history. In 1922, when Howard Carter opened Tutankhamun's tomb, he found among the pharaoh's most prized possessions a pectoral breastplate depicting the sun god Ra. At its center, carved into the shape of a sacred scarab, was a stone of unusual pale yellow color. Italian mineralogist Vincenzo de Michele confirmed in 1998 that the scarab was carved from Libyan desert glass. The most powerful ruler in the ancient world kept at the center of his most sacred garment a piece of rock formed by an explosion so large it vitrified the Sahara. Whether Tutankhamun knew what it was, no one can say. But he valued it above gold. He took it with him into death. Sacsayhuaman, high above the ancient Inca capital of Cusco, at an elevation of nearly 3,800 meters above sea level, there is a fortress that has made every archaeologist, every engineer, every materials scientist who has studied it reach for words they would not normally use in a scientific paper. The walls are constructed from limestone and andesite blocks of almost incomprehensible scale. The largest confirmed stones weigh 200 tons. They were quarried from sites 15 to 35 kilometers away, across Andean mountain terrain, across river valleys, across a landscape that makes modern structural engineers quietly put down their calculations. The blocks fit together without mortar, without adhesive, with a precision so absolute that a sheet of paper cannot be passed between them. Not most of them, all of them. But that precision is not the deepest mystery. The deepest mystery is what happened to the stone itself. Across multiple sections of Sacsayhuaman and the surrounding archaeological zone, including the Coricancha, the Kenko site, and the Temple of the Moon, the surfaces of the stone have been vitrified, fused, transformed from the crystalline structure of natural andesite into a glassy, flowing surface that carries the thermal signature of temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius. And andesite is not a delicate material. It is volcanic rock, born in the heat of the Earth's interior. To remelt it, to push it back past its own thermal threshold, requires sustained temperatures that no known ancient Andean technology should have been able to generate. Peruvian researcher Alfredo Gamarra spent years cataloging these vitrified stones and arrived at a conclusion that the mainstream archaeological community has never comfortably addressed. The stone, he argued, was once soft, treated with heat by an ancient technology that predated even the civilization that historians credit with building the site. When the Inca themselves were asked about Sacsayhuaman, they did not claim to have built it. They pointed to a prior race, a people who existed before memory, beings who, in the Inca oral tradition, had the power to make stone soft. Spanish conquistadors who arrived in the 16th century were so overwhelmed by the scale and precision of Sacsayhuaman that they recorded in their own chronicles a genuine belief that the fortress had been built by supernatural forces. Not metaphorically, they genuinely could not construct a human explanation for what they were looking at. Their chronicler, Pedro Cieza de Leon, wrote that no matter how many people were consulted about the construction, no one could provide a satisfactory account. Sacsayhuaman withstood every earthquake that has flattened the city of Cusco below it. The Spanish colonial buildings built from its salvaged stone collapsed. The fortress did not. The vitrified sections in particular, the oldest strata, have survived nearly intact, while the surrounding region has been rebuilt on average every few generations. As if whatever process fused those stones together created something that was not just strong, something that was, by any structural definition, effectively permanent. Tel Halaf. In the northeastern corner of Syria, buried beneath millennia of sand, lies one of the most perplexing destruction events in the entire archaeological record. Tel Halaf was first excavated in 1899 by German diplomat Max von Oppenheim, who found a civilization dating to approximately 6000 BCE, so sophisticated in its pottery, architecture, and civic organization that archaeologists named an entire prehistoric cultural period after it, the Halaf period. And then, beneath the sophistication, the excavation team found obliteration. Walls subjected to temperatures so extreme that mud bricks had melted and fused. Limestone blocks had calcified and crumbled where they stood, not from age, but from heat. Entire structural layers had been vitrified, scorched, and compressed into a single catastrophic horizon that archaeologists call, with clinical understatement, a destruction layer. This destruction layer is strangely, unnervingly uniform. It covers the entire site with a consistency that speaks of a single event, not a gradual fire, not a multi-source siege. Something arrived at Tel Halaf with ferocious, nearly incomprehensible heat, and it did so simultaneously, across the whole settlement, in what the archaeological record suggests was a very short period of time. Burning a wooden structure under ideal conditions generates approximately 600 degrees Celsius. The destruction at Tel Halaf shows evidence of temperatures significantly higher than that. Warfare does not explain the uniformity. Archaeology does not have a settled explanation for Tel Halaf, a settlement existing at a time when humans should not have possessed the tools for this kind of destruction, bearing the thermal fingerprint of something that 8,000 years of excavation still cannot name. The Atacama glass. In the driest desert on Earth, the Atacama in northern Chile, there is a band of green glass running roughly 75 kilometers, elongated, directional, covering an area of roughly 38 square kilometers. It was identified by researchers from Brown University and the University of Chile in 2021, and their analysis of its composition produced a result that required careful reading to believe. The glass contained materials consistent with the vaporization of a comet, cosmic dust, metalsite minerals, and the kind of chemical signatures you find when an object from outside the solar system burns through the atmosphere at extreme velocity and angle. The researchers estimated the event occurred approximately 12,000 years ago, during the Younger Dryas period, the same global cooling event that many researchers have linked to a significant cosmic impact or series of impacts that may have contributed to the extinction of the Pleistocene megafauna and the collapse of several late Paleolithic cultures. What makes this glass different from the Libyan desert glass is its shape. It is not a roughly circular scatter pattern consistent with an overhead burst or ground impact. It is elongated, directional, running in a northeast-southwest orientation across the desert. The researchers concluded the most likely explanation was a comet or asteroid traveling at an extremely shallow atmospheric angle, essentially skimming the surface, generating a superheated pressure wave and thermal pulse that ran along the ground for 75 kilometers before the object either burned out or skipped back into space. 12,000 years ago, the Atacama was not entirely uninhabited. Evidence of late Paleolithic human presence in coastal Chile dates to approximately 14,000 years ago. Whatever traveled above that desert on whatever specific day this event occurred would have been visible and terrifying to anyone who witnessed it. And if the Brown University estimate is correct, if this was part of a broader Younger Dryas impact event, then somewhere in the oral traditions of the cultures that survived it, this story may still exist, encoded in the kind of language that gets dismissed as mythology until someone finds the glass. Çatalhöyük. In the southern Anatolian plateau of modern Turkey, there is a site that has forced archaeologists to repeatedly revise their understanding of how early human civilization developed. Çatalhöyük was occupied from approximately 7500 to 5500 BCE, making it one of the earliest urban settlements ever discovered. Its inhabitants lived in densely packed mud brick structures, shared walls, entered their homes through rooftop openings, and appear to have produced sophisticated art and religious practice long before any civilization should have been culturally complex enough to do so. Multiple destruction layers at Çatalhöyük contain evidence of thermal events significantly exceeding what normal settlement fires would produce. Mud brick structures show vitrification. Some structural elements show temperatures consistent with those documented at Tel Halaf and at sites in the Scottish Highlands. The destruction layers are not continuous. They are episodic. They occur at intervals across the site's 2,000-year occupation history, suggesting that whatever caused the destruction was not a single event, but a pattern of events that struck the settlement multiple times across multiple generations. Archaeologist Ian Hodder of Stanford University, who has directed excavations at Çatalhöyük for decades, has noted that the site's inhabitants appeared to have an unusual relationship with destruction and rebuilding. New structures were layered directly on top of destroyed ones. Each destruction layer was sealed, as if deliberately preserved, and a new community was built directly above it. It has been suggested that the inhabitants treated the destruction events as sacred, as evidence of divine activity, incorporating the burned record of catastrophe into the very foundations of the next iteration of their civilization. That interpretation is worth sitting with. A community that was struck by something so powerful, so far beyond its ability to explain or prevent, that it began to build its culture around the evidence of the event, rather than attempting to erase it. A people constructing their homes on top of the proof of what they could not understand. Tiahuanaco. At almost 4,000 meters above sea level on the Bolivian Altiplano, at the southern edge of Lake Titicaca, there are ruins so anomalous that the civilization responsible for building them has never been conclusively identified. Tiahuanaco. The site covers roughly 4 square kilometers of engineered structures, stone platforms, temples, gateways, monolithic sculptures built from sandstone, andesite, and an unusual amount of an igneous rock called andesite porphyry. The largest stones weigh over 100 tons and were transported from quarries across the lake, a logistical challenge that modern engineers have described as extraordinary for any pre-industrial civilization, let alone one working at high altitude without wheeled vehicles. But Tiahuanaco's greatest mystery is not the construction. It is what appears to have interrupted it. Across the site, in what archaeologists identify as the oldest construction strata, there is evidence of a catastrophic destruction event of unclear origin. Stone blocks have been scattered as if by a massive concussive force. Some are vitrified. Some bear the marks of intense, localized heating that cannot be attributed to the ceremonial fires that are documented in the archaeological record of the site. Monumental structures appear to have been abandoned mid-construction, not gradually, not through cultural decline, but suddenly, as if the workforce simply ceased to exist in the middle of a working day. Bolivian archaeologist Arthur Poznański spent 4 decades studying Tiahuanaco in the early 20th century and reached a conclusion that the mainstream archaeological community has never fully accepted and never fully refuted. Based on the astronomical alignments of the site's major structures, specifically the Kalasasaya temple, whose walls align with solstice and equinox positions, Poznański calculated that the original construction dated to approximately 15,000 BCE, an era in which, according to every standard model of human cultural development, complex civilization should not have existed. Whether Poznański's astronomical dating is correct remains debated. What is not debated is that Tiahuanaco is old, very old. And that something, force, heat, concussion, disaster, interrupted its construction with the abruptness of a sentence that ends in the middle of a Baalbek. In the Bekaa Valley of modern Lebanon, there is a platform of stone that stands as one of the most sobering architectural riddles in the world. The Temple of Jupiter at Baalbek was built by the Romans in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE. It is a magnificent structure by any standard. But beneath the Roman temple, integrated into its foundation, are 3 stones that no Roman crane, no Roman engineering system, no Roman anything can account for. The trilithon, 3 monolithic limestone blocks, each approximately 19 meters long, 4.5 meters high, 3.5 meters deep, each weighing an estimated 800 tons. They are the largest worked stones ever incorporated into a standing structure in human history. They sit in the foundation of the Roman temple as if they were simply there when the Romans arrived, waiting to be built upon. A 4th stone, lying in a nearby quarry, still partially attached to bedrock, is estimated at over 1,000 tons. It is called the Stone of the Pregnant Woman, and it has never moved. The quarry is located 1 kilometer from the platform. Moving an 800-ton stone 1 kilometer across ancient Levantine terrain, without wheels, without modern cranes, without any mechanism yet proposed by engineering analysis, and then lifting it to a height of 6 meters and placing it with sufficient precision that it has not shifted in 2,000 years of seismic activity, is a task modern structural engineers describe with a consistency that crosses disciplines. They describe it as impossible. Specific sections of the Baalbek platform stones show thermal scarring inconsistent with the weathering or age of the structure. Localized vitrification on surfaces that face specific directions. A pattern of heat exposure that suggests an event arriving from a particular angle with a particular intensity. Not the result of construction. Not the result of Roman-era activity. Something that left its mark on rock that was already ancient by the time Julius Caesar was born. The Temple Mount, Jerusalem. Beneath the most contested religious site on earth, beneath the foundations of structures that have been built, destroyed, rebuilt, and contested for 3,000 years, there is bedrock. And in that bedrock, there are anomalies. Specific zones of thermal alteration documented by geologists who have had limited but unprecedented access to the subsurface strata beneath the Temple Mount. Areas where the limestone shows the characteristic glassy alteration of vitrification temperatures that could not have been produced by the ritual fires of temple practice, by the destruction of the first or second temple, or by any military assault recorded in the millennia of documented conflict at this site. The Israeli archaeologist Benjamin Mazar, who conducted extensive excavations at the base of the Temple Mount from 1968 to 1978, documented destruction layers whose thermal signatures puzzled his team. The deepest layers, the ones predating the Solomonic period, predating any structure that history remembers, contained evidence of an event so energetic it had permanently altered the physical character of the bedrock at the most sacred coordinate on Earth. 3 major religions claim this ground as the center of their cosmological understanding. 3 traditions describe a catastrophic event in the deep past that remade the relationship between heaven and earth. And in the bedrock beneath the place where all 3 converge, the stone records a heat event that no temple fire, no siege, no documented human activity can adequately explain. Now here is what the official record cannot explain. These 10 sites are separated by continents and by millennia. Mohenjo-Daro in Pakistan, Tall El Hammam in Jordan, the vitrified forts of Scotland, the Libyan desert, Sacsayhuaman in Peru, Tel Halaf in Syria, the Atacama in Chile, Çatalhöyük in Turkey, Tiahuanaco in Bolivia, Baalbek in Lebanon. They belong to different cultures, different geological zones, different periods of human history spanning from 6000 BCE to roughly 1500 BCE, with the Scottish forts extending into the Iron Age and beyond. They have no contact with each other. They share no trade routes, no religious traditions, no linguistic connections that could explain a shared practice of deliberate stone melting at these temperatures. What they share is the stone, and the stone does not lie. Every one of these sites contains vitrification that exceeds the thermal capacity of its known technology by a significant and documented margin. Every one of them was studied by researchers who began with conventional explanations and arrived, after years of examination, at an uncomfortable boundary where the conventional explanations failed. Not failed entirely, failed sufficiently that the researchers kept qualifying their conclusions, kept saying things like, "The evidence is consistent with," or "we cannot rule out," or "the temperatures recorded here exceed what known ancient technology could have produced." That last phrase is worth hearing again. The temperatures recorded here exceed what known ancient technology could have produced. That is not a fringe conclusion. That is the considered language of peer-reviewed geological analysis, applied repeatedly across multiple continents to ruins that have been in the ground for thousands of years. There are 3 categories of explanation that researchers have seriously proposed. The first is lost technology. Ancient civilizations in possession of thermal or energy generation capabilities that either predated the civilizations we know or existed alongside them and were not preserved in the archaeological record. Alfredo Gamarra in Peru and David Davenport in Pakistan both arrived at versions of this conclusion through entirely separate research programs on entirely separate continents. The second is cosmic catastrophe meteor airbursts, comet strikes, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, events delivered from outside the atmosphere that deposited enormous thermal energy across large surface areas with no warning and no crater. The Tall El Hammam paper whatever its current academic status, produced 21 authors from 19 institutions who examined 15 years of excavation data and concluded that a cosmic airburst was the most consistent explanation for what they found. The Atacama glass researchers reached a similar conclusion for a different site 5,000 miles away. The third possibility is one that almost no researcher states directly, but that sits at the edges of many conversations about these sites. That the pattern is not coincidental, that the consistency of the destruction signature across cultures and continents and millennia suggests something that revisited the Earth more than once, something that struck Çatalhöyük in 7000 BCE, and Tel Halaf in 6000 BCE, and Mohenjo-Daro in 1900 BCE, and Tol el Hammam in 1650 BCE, and the Scottish hill forts in 500 BCE, something that operated on a cycle, something that the ancient texts, the Mahabharata, the Book of Genesis, the Vedic hymns, the oral traditions of the Inca, the Norse accounts of Ragnarok, the Greek myths of Phaethon driving the sun's chariot too close to the earth and burning the world, may have been documenting not as myth, but as memory. The physicist Paul Laviolette has proposed that these destruction events are consistent with a recurring galactic wave, a superwave emanating from the center of the Milky Way and periodically bathing the solar system in a flux of cosmic energy intense enough to trigger exactly the kind of thermal and electromagnetic events preserved in the vitrified record. His theory is contested. Every theory that explains this pattern is contested. The pattern itself is not. Because here is the thing about stone. Stone does not burn without a cause. Stone does not vitrify through wishful thinking or deliberate exaggeration or the feverish imagination of alternative historians. When granite melts, something melted it. When zircon crystals record pressures of 10 gigapascals, something compressed them. When a destruction layer 1.5 meters thick covers every square meter of a city in a single stratigraphic event, something produced that layer. And when that layer contains platinum and iridium at concentrations that belong in a meteorite, not in a Bronze Age city, something brought that material to Earth. The sites exist. The temperatures are real. The ancient texts are real. And 10 civilizations across 8,000 years of human history, across every inhabited continent, in ruins that modern science continues to study, with instruments their builders could not have imagined, left behind the same evidence, the same signature, the same story told in melted stone, a story whose full meaning we have not yet been willing to hear. The question is not whether something happened. The stone has already answered that. The question is what it was, whether it will happen again, and whether the civilizations that survived it and tried to record it in their sacred texts were leaving us a warning or simply a record of their helplessness. The ground knows. It has known for thousands of years. Every time someone puts a geological instrument to one of these sites, it tells them the same temperature, the same pressure, the same directional signature arriving from above, over and over and over, at sites so far apart that coordinating their destruction would have required something operating at a scale that only one kind of force in the known universe can achieve. And if you want to know what that force is, and where it has been since the last time it visited these ruins, the question you should be asking is not an archaeological one. It is an astronomical one. And the answer to that question is not in the past. It is somewhere in the sky above us, right now, following whatever path brought it here before. If this video made you stop and think, if it made you look at ancient ruins differently than you did an hour ago, hit the subscribe button. There are stories buried in every corner of this earth, in stone and ash and silence, and we are only just beginning to read them. More of those stories are coming. Don't miss them.